pressed play, just give me a little thumbs up.
Just did.
Cool. Awesome, guys. Hey, everybody. I'm Captain Planet here with Betty Osceola, the Miccosukee tribe. She was awesome enough to take us out on the airboat. I highly suggest you guys take her to her. What better representative of the Everglades than you? When we were standing earlier talking, I was listening to some of Betty's stories, and she was talking about how, you know, your ancestors said that there wasn't walls of seagrass and walls of cattails like there are now. And I couldn't help but to think, with my scientific background, you know, nutrient pollution, you know, that Mother Earth's gonna take her opportunities when we can. You know, we look at that grass as being a little bit invasive, but it's native, you know, and what's going on is we're the invasive ones. You know, our nutrient pollution and our hydrology, how we affected the water flow. So me as a guy looking in the Everglades for some of the first times with an experienced guide, it doesn't matter what I know about science. I'm gonna look and just appreciate what I'm seeing. You know, it takes somebody with a history of knowing what they're doing and listening to their relatives. That's why you guys always see me in bait shops. What do you think as far as the nutrient pollution? You know, we were just sitting here looking at some weeds that have been sprayed with glyphosate most likely, and it's talking about the murky water. What's your opinion?
Well, when we to get to this area, we passed through some very cattail dense and sawgrass dense vegetation, and I had to explain earlier how over time, you know, our elders had seen the area go from open water Everglades for as far as the eye could see. All you saw was shimmering water, and you had some sawgrass and you had some cattail, but not like what we're seeing today, and how all of that has been able to have muck build up over time, and the nutrients got, like, you know, like a population explosion, you know, cattails on steroids, you know, cattails gone wild. That's what I was
Right?
thinking, right?
That's a good one.
Yeah. So coming here, and then as we started getting into the interior of Water Conservation Area 3A and tribal lands, you started getting into the healthier part, and it started opening up some. So and we started getting more areas of less dense in that vegetation. And then as we came through to the cypress trees that are on the Western Conservation Area 3A and borders the Big Cypress Preserve, it was all connected once. And right now we're standing on a levee that was created by man to make that disruption of the water flow. And when I got in, and the water's been low, but with the rains, it's raised it up. So when I got into the canal, remembering what I normally remember coming up here, you know, I was like, okay, the water's a little bit more murkier than what I should be seeing. Even though the water's low and it can get murky, it's got a little bit more of a greener tinge to it than what we kind of see. It's like, and I started thinking into my head, what's different? So I started thinking, okay, I'm seeing something different with the change in the water. And what else is I'm seeing that is also different that might be one of the reasons. So I started looking on the levee and started seeing all the dead vegetation, which tells me it had been sprayed and instead of mowed. And with the recent rains, I was like, okay, well, maybe with the recent rains, it's made that chemical run off into the water, and it's also feeding that chemical into the water. And also by killing that plant life, that's also running off back into the water. And those are, you know, we were talking about invasive species like the water hyacinth, some forms of duckweed, and some other plant life, is that so those invasive species like water hyacinths cleans and filters water. And as a kid, you know, I remember my mom and grandma saying, yeah, the water's probably real dirty because we got a lot of water hyacinths, and that cleans the water and it filters it. And that's why you see that. So instead of trying to eradicate and spray it, and when it dies, all those nutrients goes back into the water, maybe we need to think about being you know, looking on the positive side and using that to clean the water and do something else with it.
Absolutely.
Instead of mining for more phosphate, why don't we like reclaim, take out that water hyacinth that absorbed all those nutrients and use it as a fertilizer? Or in other countries, I started looking around to see what they're doing with water hyacinth. One gentleman is making paper from it. One lady is making handbags from it. Another person is making furniture with it. So there's a market for water hyacinth. You can use it, one, to clean up the water, and two, people can make a living with it and help the environment at the same time. And I try to think outside of the box. Because right now, the state of Florida and all around the world, most everyone is being reactive. We react instead of being taking care of the health and thinking of thinking outside of the box and how we can make things work better.
Think offense instead of defense.
Yes, and okay, let's take something that's a negative. What's that? Take some lemons and make some lemonade.
Right.
That kind of concept.
Just like we were talking with the duckweed over here.
Yeah.
Yes, this is the invasive kind from Asia. However, I don't see a problem. I see an opportunity to take the nutrients out of the water, farming the pollution. So I think it's a great concept if we could just get more people on board. Alan Smith, for example, I believe that's his name.
Alan Stewart.
Bad with names, but he does some similar work. He was there when we met, giving a talk. So very similar thoughts, whether you're talking about someone from spiritual backgrounds or someone from science backgrounds or someone like me with a little bit of both. So it's an interesting concept, and I think if we raised a little bit more awareness that this right here with the spraying, it's not good. You see how the slope flows right down to the water that we're talking about being murky. So it's just a little bit of common sense, in my opinion. Because
it comes down to money, which I mentioned earlier. That some decisions, when I was explaining to them earlier, a few years back, one of the tree islands further south had some old structures with it, and the state put out some bidding to rehab that island. But the person that came in with the lowest bid had a barge, and we didn't know all that was, I didn't know all that was going on, and all of a sudden I saw water just shoot up in levels. When we're in a low water season, next thing you know, we got these extreme waters. The water's just rising. Overnight, if water raises like 4 inches, you're like, something's going on. And it kept rising, so I started asking questions like, what's going on? Why is the water raising so high really rapidly when we're in a low water season? And we knew the turtles, snakes, and alligators had just laid their eggs, dropped their eggs.
Yep.
And they need that low water to give those eggs time to hatch.
It's detrimental if it goes up too fast.
Yes. And so when I started asking questions, it's turned out that the state took a bid for somebody to remove the debris off the island. They had a barge, so they intentionally flooded Water Conservation Area 3A so this individual could go with his barge, because it was going to save the state money. But they didn't take into the dollar fact for every turtle, alligator, snake, and other animal life that was killed, which would have cost more than the money they saved by using that barge. So this is I keep asking for it too. It's another part of the conversation that is missing. When we talk about Everglades restoration and we talk about seepage control, dollar value is always assigned to homes, property values lost, homes destroyed, and agriculture, which is important, because we got to eat.
Yeah.
Which is important. Those have all dollar values, but they don't assign a dollar value to study how much animal life and habitat that is destroyed, because they haven't done a recent study to see, as far as I know, a recent study hasn't been done to see how many tree islands that have been lost throughout the years. The last study was probably over 20 years ago, I believe in the 80s, where at that time it was 60% lost. Can you imagine now? So and if you had to and people were doing pilot projects to recreate a tree island. So I would think if you take a tree island loss, how much is costing the state to make one, and assign all those islands that they know that they lost, and multiply that's going to be more than these crop values lost that they're seeing on an annual basis.
It affects it all too.
It affects it all.
The climate change. And these trees sequester carbon, and that's worth the monetary value right there.
Yeah, just like you need the mangroves on the shores to your first line of defense from land erosion, and to help the integrity of you. You don't want to be like Louisiana, where they made the mistake of they kept dredging, and just like Florida now wants to dredge everything for their ports. They're losing that integrity to keep their land mass, which doesn't get into the equation. So the tree islands, they serve an important purpose for the rebirth cycle of the environment out here. And when the water levels are higher, that's where your deer and your other fur-bearing animals are going to go into those islands. We got bear out here, they're going to go up onto those islands looking for food. And because you have the loss of tree islands, and when they're submerged underwater, then the animals come up onto these levees and eat. But what the deer and other animals normally eat, there's not an abundance of those plants on these levees. So then you get where Fish and Wildlife, or whether it's the tribe, will put out food for the deer feed, because it's not the quality of plants that they need to be eating. And that's something I think that people need to be a part of that conversation in the decision-making process. Because right now, everybody, like now, we've seen water, some pumps running to the east, bordering Miami, where they're pumping water in here. We're like, okay, Miami probably doesn't want to get their feet wet, so they're pumping water here. And you got water being pumped here, because the urban areas, you want flood control, because nobody wants to get their feet wet. And they don't want to drive through a flooded street. But then you're thinking, well, if there's septics, if they're on septics, there's some that are on septics, that's going to get into the water. So if they're pumping that water into the water conservation areas out of the urban areas, you're pumping all those nutrients from the urban areas, whether it's the runoff from the asphalt, the yards, and their fertilizer. And if they're on a septic system, then, all those nutrients, and you're pumping it into the Everglades. And eventually, there's a pump that's right there. I think it's the S334. And when you see that pump running, and they recirculate water from South Dade up through that canal and into the Everglades National Park, I'm like, okay, here everybody's saying there's water quality and certain quality of water to go into the park. I said, but do they realize they're pumping city runoff into the park too by activating these pumps? But because of seepage control and circulating that water, apparently that's okay. I'm like, how did it become okay?
Right.
And that's another part of the conversation that doesn't get in there. So there's all these little pieces to the puzzle that we have to look at, and not just say, oh, it's just phosphorus, oh, it's just nitrogen. It's everything that together that gets into the environment, and we're just standing in one part of that. And the point that I always try to make is, whether you're in the Big Cypress Preserve, which is to my left, or whether you're in Water Conservation Area 3A, these are part of the historic Everglades. Just because it got labeled the Big Cypress Preserve, just because it got labeled Water Conservation 3A, and people think of it as an water impoundment area, does not take away from the fact that they are historic Everglades, and they deserve protection, just like Everglades National Park, because Everglades National Park is just a piece of the Everglades.
Absolutely.
And for its health, this has to be healthy, for that to be healthy. And no matter what you do to get water down to Florida Bay, you're not doing diddly squat until you take care of this area.
Absolutely.
In my unscientific terms.
Because sometimes I confuse people, because when they shout to send the water south, I'm that first guy saying, whoa, hold your horses there. Because we have to have that water clean before we can just send it south.
We have to have the water clean. And
no matter what way we send it, really.
Yeah, and what I mentioned earlier is the Everglades has to go down to a dry down period, because that's its rebirth cycle. It gets reborn in the dry down. Just like I mentioned, crawdads needs to have that water dry down so that their numbers can increase. And just like when you have a dry down and you have areas that still have some water, you have the wading birds with legs only so long that have to be able to walk around and to eat food. And a lot of people think the Everglades always has to have a lot of water. If you always are having a lot of water flowing through it, like some people want it to just flow because they're only worried about the seagrasses in Florida Bay, they don't realize that they're not giving this part of this ecosystem the opportunity for rebirth. And that's why things are getting so impacted, because people don't realize, just like human beings go have a rebirth cycle and they produce offspring, nature has to have its rebirth cycle and to regenerate and produce offspring. You got to be able to have that natural fires during the dry season, because that's nature's way of cleaning her house, so other things can come in and grow. And so it's trying to understand
just like
all
breathing.
of that. Yes, right?
Where we exhale and we inhale. If I tell you to breathe and you only do one or the other, it's not going to work out for you so well.
Yeah.
It's the thing that you told me when we first met the other week. You know, I'll never forget that. You said, you know, I couldn't understand what you were saying in Lakota. It's like you couldn't understand what I was saying in Miccosukee. But if we get together and both speak English, I bet you we could talk to
Yes.
each other.
Yep.
You know, and if we all did that with each other, you know, we just need to have a big powwow and a sit down and all talk to each other and work this out from all angles. You know, sometimes we get a little bit too obsessed with one part of the puzzle, and we're forgetting that we're putting a puzzle together.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you can't just concentrate on one piece, you know, or you're never going to get but 5 pieces away.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah, you have to. Well, I always tell people personally, I'll always listen to what you have to say. It doesn't mean I will agree with you,
Mm-hmm.
or I may, after I hear what your perception is, I may agree with you, or it might provoke some thought that, hey, you know, there's something might trigger. Oh my gosh, why didn't I think of this?
Mm-hmm.
Or and a person has very important life experiences, and I was talking about that anecdotal history of what has happened here in the environment, and people seeing those changes through not just their lifetime, but their fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. All of that is an important part of the conversation that needs to be added, but people tend to ignore it because it wasn't proven by science. But
Yeah.
it gives a clearer picture
Absolutely,
of what
it does.
happened, because you have to know where you came from to know where you're going. And that people don't really want to realize where they want to know where they came from. That's why they have no idea where they're going.
Just lost.
Yeah. Also, when we need to have that conversation, when I come out into the Everglades, I have the conversation with the trees. I'm listening. I'm seeing the birds, those alligators that we saw. I'm listening. They are talking to us. And, you know, people say, oh, they're not saying words, this and that. You're seeing their behavior, their movement, how they're acting. Just like they're talking when we saw a whole bunch of gators coming into their little airboat trails into this waterway. People would probably like, why are there so many